The Nazis just loved mega projects, didn't they? From the heaviest tank the world has ever seen to portable cannons the size of city blocks, they really had a penchant for blowing ludicrous amounts of taxpayers' cash on gimmicky junk that made a dubious, at best, contribution to the war effort. Take the Schwere Gustav, one of those city block-sized cannons as an example. It cost as much as dozens, maybe even hundreds of tanks, and was about as accurate as a horoscope. Then there was the Maus, the aforementioned world's heaviest tank, a 207-ton behemoth that could barely even move, produced right at the tail end of the war when Germany needed every flake of steel it had to just have a chance of preventing the inevitable. But even with examples such as those, one stands above the rest as a complete and utterly nonsensical waste of resources. The Atlantic Wall, which was exactly what it sounds like, an enormous line of fortifications stretching from the northern tip of Norway down to the Spanish border and then pointing out into the Atlantic with the sole purpose of keeping the Western Allies out of continental Europe. And today, we're going to learn all about it. Squarespace is the sponsor of today's video, and they're the all-in-one platform where you can build your online presence. Look, whatever you're up to. You're launching a project, maybe a business, maybe you just need a place to showcase your work. Well, Squarespace make it ridiculously easy. I've been using Squarespace for, ages. I think Squarespace first sponsored me a long time ago, and I was like, okay, cool, I'll make my personal website using Squarespace, why not? And it was super easy. You choose a template, you use their drag and drop editor, and you're good to go. And that was a few years ago. Since then, the drag and drop editors got awesome. They've now integrated all this AI stuff, so it just works super quickly. And I originally made my website in like an afternoon. It'd be even quicker today. It's really good. And of course, there's no coding, there's no stress. Also built-in SEO tools, so your site can actually be seen. All the technical stuff's handled, so you just build your website, you do what you do, and Squarespace handle all of the rest, plus memberships, courses, exclusive content that you can sell with Squarespace. Yes. So if you've got an idea, make it real. Head to squarespace.com/megaprojects for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use the code MEGAPROJECTS to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. The fall of France in June 1940 was one of Nazi Germany's most stunning military victories. In a mere 6 weeks, they had achieved what their imperial forerunners had failed to do in 4 years, utterly decimating the French army, then considered one of the strongest in the world, and sending the British army packing back over the English Channel. But while Germany was doing rather well in France at that time, it was also far from their only victory in Western Europe. By the end of 1940, they could also count themselves as the overlords of Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and the British Channel Islands. All that new territory, however, was actually a double-edged sword, because with the glory of immediate victory came the long-term and frankly abjectly terrifying prospect of an Allied counterattack. No stress though. The man with the moustache reasoned they'd just negotiate a peace with Britain, and then happy days, his Reich might actually last for 1,000 years, as he famously proclaimed. Churchill, however, not having any of that nonsense, and as he stood atop the white cliffs of Dover, jowls are waving as he shouted out all the places he'd be happy to meet Hitler for a little rumble, thoughts began to be given to defending all of that newly captured territory in Western Europe, as clearly Britain was not going to be surrendering. But while it was a thought that was entertained, it wasn't exactly an overly pressing concern, at least immediately. With Hitler and much of the Nazi military elite having a bit of a attitude to the matter. But that attitude rapidly changed on the 23rd of March 1942 when Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 40, which formally initiated the construction of the Atlantic Wall. The pivot was motivated by things like the US entry into the war and the grinding to a halt of the advance on the Eastern Front, both factors that made Hitler realize that the days of Blitzkrieg were now long over and it was time to get defensive instead. And it was nothing if not a prophetic choice, because not even a week later, the British launched their Saint-Nazaire raid, which saw the Royal Navy put 611 handy blokes ashore by sticking them on rickety old World War I era destroyer HMS Campbelltown and then ramming her right into the Normandy dry dock situated in the raid's titular town. From there, those men proceeded to jump out and shoot at anything that moved as they fought their way back to the sea to make their escape, shortly before 4.5 tons of explosives buried deep within Campbelltown's hull exploded on a timer, rendering the dry dock, which had originally been built for the ocean liner Normandy, hence its name, and was large enough to service capital ships, was totally out of action for the remainder of the war. This was then followed up by another, far larger raid in August of that same year, the Dieppe raid. This saw over 6,000 mostly Canadian men put ashore with a view to capturing the titular port for a time in order to test the feasibility of larger-scale landings, gather a bit of intelligence, and also give the Germans a bit of a bloody nose while doing so. But while the Saint-Nazaire raid was an incredible success, the Dieppe raid was an incredible failure, one in which only one of the landing forces managed to get ashore and take its objective, and even then it was done very temporarily before the whole effort was pushed back into the sea at a cost of over 900 lives. So, now that we know about the circumstances that brought the Atlantic Wall into being, let's move on and start having a look at the wall itself, starting with all the circumstances and machinations that influenced its construction. The Nazi military leadership was deeply divided over how best to defend against an Allied invasion. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of German forces in Western Europe, for example, saw the Atlantic Wall as fundamentally flawed, believing that static defenses were a relic of World War I and that a mobile, counter-attacking force was the only way to repel an invasion. But unfortunately for him, it was Hitler who held the purse strings, and so his belief that the Allies should never even be allowed to land in the first place ultimately won the day. And this in many ways set the tone for the entire project, one in which too many cooks were trying to contribute to the broth, and it became oh so very flawed as a result. Take for example Erwin Rommel, the famed field marshal of Afrika Korps fame. He was assigned to oversee the fortifications in 1943, and while he agreed with Hitler's sentiments of preventing the Allies from getting a foothold and keeping them in the sea, years of fighting in both Africa and Italy had taught him the potency of combined arms amphibious assaults, those which involved all assets that a military can muster on land, sea, and in the air. As a result, he pushed for a bit of common-sense wiggle room on the idea, wherein they weren't meant to literally hold them at the beach, but rather prevent them from establishing a foothold beyond it. So, he implemented measures that would afford a bit of defensive depth and layered resistance, chiefly through the use of mines, obstacles, and anti-tank defenses, both on the beach alongside the giant concrete fortifications and immediately behind it. And then there was the question of where to actually build it, because while the idea of a giant wall of fortified concrete along the Reich's western frontier seemed like a big and clever one, it was also an idea that if implemented in literally that manner, wouldn't just be ruinously expensive, but would be flatly impossible. So, invariably, materials and manpower would have to be rationed, leaving parts of the wall better defended than others. Hitler, for his part, had key locations that he deemed most likely to be attacked and thus demanded be heavily defended, with a particularly notable example being the area around Calais, the part of France closest to England. But thanks to military intelligence being a thing, guess what the Allies did upon discovering this fact? Yep. They just invaded somewhere else, hence the invasion of France being called the Normandy campaign. But all this talk of Hitler, generals, and field marshals, it doesn't really get across just how many vying parties were meddling with the wall's construction. There was also, for example, Organization Todt, officially established in 1933 as a civil and military engineering outfit responsible for overseeing the construction of the Reich's most ambitious infrastructure projects. It naturally had enormous sway in the on-the-ground implementation of the Atlantic Wall, as it would be its engineers, as well as its laborers, both the paid and slave variety, who would be constructing large parts of it. Their influence was multifaceted too, with it sometimes being Albert Speer, its executive from 1942, taking amendments directly to Hitler seeking approval, and on the other extreme, it could be an engineer at a construction site taking a look at some given plans, deciding it was rubbish, and just drafting something new there on the spot. And then there was the Wehrmacht's Fortress Engineering Corps, which designed many of the fortifications, and so gave its own 2 cents worth as well, in addition to Nazi Party officials, particularly regional Gaultiers, who, if they didn't stick their noses into the construction efforts in their area, weren't exactly above helping themselves to the materials and funds allocated to the wall to line their own pockets. You get the idea then. Theoretically, there was a clear chain of command responsible for the wall's implementation, but in reality, yeah, it wasn't like that. And with that said, we think it's about time to start discussing the actual wall. As we've already said, constructing the Atlantic Wall required a lot of resources. But just how many? Well, we're in luck on that front. Because while many of the Nazi documents that would be most vital for modern historians found their way into a furnace as the war came to an end, documents pertaining to the Atlantic Wall survived relatively unscathed, and so we know exactly how many resources it consumed. Over 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel. Now, those are big numbers. Let's put them in perspective. That amount of concrete is enough to fill up 6,800 Olympic-sized swimming pools, and that much steel is enough to build 164 Eiffel Towers. The steel point is a particularly pertinent one too, because to put it in more martial terms, that is the same amount of steel that would be used in the construction of, wait for it, 50,000 Panzer IV tanks, a model of tank which, for reference, Germany only built 8,553 of in total. Now, obviously, in real terms, we can't say, oh, if they'd just gone along with the flexible defense plan, they would have had 50,000 more Panzer IVs, because it isn't a one-to-one comparison when we consider things like the fact that the tanks would then need to be manufactured at a cost of industrial infrastructure and manpower, but the comparison checks out, at least in terms of raw steel, and so it makes a great talking point for demonstrating just how many resources the Atlantic Wall did consume. Now, the vast amount of resources required for the effort, coupled with the absurd amount of labor needed and the logistical demands of it all, also meant that it ended up costing the Reich a pretty penny, specifically 3.7 billion Reichsmarks. Now, comparing Reichsmarks to something more familiar like, say, dollars can be a bit of a difficult task if we want to be truly accurate, as there's a whole bunch of economic weirdness to account for that we're not going to bore you with. But for a rough figure, just to give you context, by the official exchange rate, that's about $9.25 billion in World War II money. Adjusted for inflation, that would be about $160 billion today, which is roughly the entire GDP of Kuwait or Morocco. So yeah, quite expensive. Hitler and his goons, though, were well aware that the Atlantic Wall would be a tad dear, and so an attempt was made to standardize construction to make sure they got maximum bang for their buck, with the Wehrmacht's Fortress Engineer Corps developing hundreds of standardized bunker designs, all of them built according to predetermined specifications to make sure that every possible geographic arrangement was accounted for. As for what those standards were, so-called B-standard bunkers, which were the most common type, were designed with 2-meter thick walls to withstand 210mm artillery shells and aerial bombs up to 500 kilos in size. B1 standard bunkers, by comparison, were a smidge weaker, using 1 to 1.2 meter thick walls, and were often designed to be buried to compensate for their reduced protection. A standard bunkers, however, were the heftiest of the lot, being designed with 3.5 meter thick walls capable of resisting heavy naval bombardment and basically all aerial attacks, save for those by the RAF's fancy bunker busters, the Grand Slam, the Tall Boy, things like that. A standards were rare, however, and built only in the most high-value locations, but because they were so vital, they also came primed with gas-proof doors and ventilation systems, just to be safe. There were also tiny C and D standard bunkers. These were really just small ones with thinner walls that were only meant to withstand small arms and a bit of shrapnel. Now, we won't mention too many of the specific designs, as there are hundreds of them, and would be here all day, but there are a few particularly interesting examples to note, such as the Tobruk, as it has gone down in common parlance, or the Ring Stand 58C bunker, if we're to use proper nomenclature. It was very much a B1 standard bunker in terms of its concrete thickness, and was essentially, as you can see on the screen now, a concrete hole in the ground with a little bit poking out of the back to store extra ammo, and also to have a little sleep if you were posted to it overnight. Typically, it would be a machine gun emplacement poking out of the top, although many were also built using the turrets of obsolete tanks, particularly Renault R35s and Hotchkiss H39s. As for why this one is worth knowing about, as it is, after all, this will put a concrete hole in the ground, that would be due to the fact that this model, for some reason, has really stuck in the historical zeitgeist, possibly due to the fact that it was the most common bunker type in Normandy, and also possibly due to the fact that it looks a bit weird, and so presents itself as a standout feature on battlefield tours. Either way, it's a commonly known thing, so we wanted to be sure that You know about it too. You're welcome. And that pretty much is it for what you need to know about the wall's construction. They used combinations of all of these bunker types, and if it was somewhere that the Germans, or more rather Hitler himself, deemed important, you'd see more of the bigger fancier ones, and if it was somewhere he deemed less important, you'd see more of the little simple ones. And as we touched on in the last chapter, around it all would be assorted gubbins like trenches, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields. All straightforward enough, really. Soon enough, however, as made obvious by the fact that we aren't presenting this video to you in German, the time would come for the Atlantic Wall to be tested, and that, of course, would be on the 6th of June 1944, when the Allies commenced Operation Overlord, their amphibious invasion of France. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, however, it's worth focusing on how the Atlantic Wall looked in Normandy, specifically at that time, since its construction was so varied. And as you've no doubt surmised from our earlier discussion of Hitler specifically really going to town, fortifying Calais, and the Allies choosing to invade Normandy as a result, it was far from the beefiest and most substantial part of the line. However, don't think for a second that it was all but undefended, as it most certainly was not. Despite, as much as they would like you to, the Allies couldn't just go for the weakest part of the line, as the further they got from British shores, the more difficult the logistical operation to support the landings became. So, with 2 million men to put ashore during the operation, alongside 4,000 tanks, they instead had to find a landing zone that struck the perfect balance between weaker defenses and vicinity. And that's why Normandy was chosen. As for the specifics of what was part of the Normandy Atlantic Wall, it had 2,000 structures, i.e. bunkers and bunker-like things, 200,000 obstacles, barbed wire, tank traps, stuff like that, and over 2 million mines, so you can see what we mean about it not exactly being undefended. Also operational were 23 separate gun batteries, albeit with a few of those not entirely being finished yet. Equipped with 152mm naval guns, it also had reinforced concrete casemates designed to resist bombardment. The meatiest of the lot, however, was probably the Pont de Hoc battery, armed with 155mm howitzers, or rather, it was usually the meatiest, because in what was a remarkable stroke of luck for the Allies, its guns were actually pulled out a few days before the invasion. Of the specific beaches, Omaha had the most formidable defenses, benefiting from a network of bluffs, reinforced trenches, and interlocking bunkers that provided a lethal crossfire zone. Strongpoints such as WN-65 contained 5cm anti-tank guns mounted in casemates, supported by machine gun nests and mortars. The defenses along Utah Beach, by comparison, were less extensive, with scattered Tobruk bunkers, minefields, and light artillery, relying on flooding inland areas to delay an advance. Beyond the beaches, Normandy's interior featured an additional layer of defenses. The infamous Bocage country, a labyrinth of high hedgerows with deep sunken roads, was naturally suited for defense. German forces adapted this terrain by fortifying hedgerows with machine gun positions, dugouts, and concealed anti-tank guns that could ambush advancing Allied armor. The Normandy section of the Atlantic Wall also had a few critical weaknesses, beside the fact that it was thinner than in other areas. For example, the defensive garrisons were a mix of veteran German troops, inexperienced conscripts, and foreign auxiliary units, many of whom lacked motivation or adequate training. The coastal artillery lacked radar targeting systems, making them ineffective against fast-moving naval targets. Lastly, many defensive positions, not just some of the gun batteries, were undermanned. And that is pretty much all you need to know to set the scene for the 6th of June. As the sun rose over the English Channel on that fateful morning, the largest amphibious invasion in history began its approach to the shores of Normandy. The Atlantic Wall was about to face its trial by fire. The first blow came from the sky. Before dawn, a thunderous aerial bombardment shook the defensive positions along the coast. British and American bombers carpeted the beaches with thousands of tons of explosives, seeking to weaken the gun positions, demolish bunkers, and obliterate key strongpoints before the landings began. However, due to poor visibility and the need to avoid hitting the incoming invasion fleet, much of the bombardment fell short, leaving many of the German fortifications intact. The defenders emerged from their bunkers dazed but ready as the invasion fleet loomed on the horizon. Then came the naval guns. Hundreds of warships, from mighty battleships to agile destroyers, unleashed a devastating barrage against the coastline. Massive shells rained down on pillboxes, artillery batteries, and defensive trenches, reducing some positions to rubble while others withstood the onslaught, their reinforced concrete proving resilient. Even as shells crashed into their positions, German gunners prepared for what was to come next. The landing of Allied infantry. When the first landing craft doors dropped at 6:30 a.m., the Atlantic Wall's deadliest test began in earnest. On some beaches, such as Utah, the German defenders were caught off guard, their numbers weakened, and their strong points inadequately manned. The American troops started coming ashore and met relatively light resistance, pushing inland with far fewer casualties than expected. But on Omaha Beach, the defenders were prepared and determined. The coastal bluffs were bristling with machine guns, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions that raked the exposed Allied troops with merciless fire. The men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions waded into a nightmare, caught in a killing zone where progress seemed impossible. Yet even at Omaha, where the Atlantic Wall performed at its brutal best, it could not hold forever. Despite enormous losses, the Americans clawed their way forward, finding gaps, using naval gunfire support, and taking out key German strongpoints one by one. The fortified defenses, so long touted as impenetrable by Hitler, were being overcome, not through sheer force, but through the unrelenting determination of the attacking forces. At other beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the British and Canadian troops faced a mixture of fierce and fragmented resistance. At Juno, for example, the first waves met with stiff opposition, but once the infantry breached the first line of defenses, the advance inland moved rapidly. The Germans, spread too thinly and lacking proper reinforcements, struggled to contain the attackers. Inland defenses designed to support the wall and launch counterattacks were ineffective. Many had been bombed out, and the Wehrmacht's mobile reserves were too slow to react. By midday, the Atlantic Wall was cracking. German artillery positions were being overrun, bunkers captured or bypassed, and defenders either killed or forced to surrender. Come nightfall, the Allies had broken out of all the beaches and established a foothold, just as every German bigwig with a say in the Atlantic Wall, regardless of their strategic preferences, had dreaded they would. Although, admittedly, despite the success, the Allies' progress was still slower than had been hoped, as best demonstrated by Caen, a city that had been a day one objective but would ultimately hold out until the 19th of July, 43 days into Operation Overlord. And from there, the rest was history. And despite hitting the odd speed bump along the way, the Allies would maintain the momentum until they'd advanced right into the heart of Germany, and the Reich finally collapsed. The Atlantic Wall, for all the expectations thrust upon it and the vast, vast amount of resources that had been consumed by it, had been a failure, delaying the Allies by a few hours if we go by breakout time, and maybe a few days at best if we go by a delays and issues in establishing a cemented foothold thanks to the Atlantic Wall kind of standard. But then again, that's the recurring story of all Nazi megastructures, isn't it? On paper, absolutely cracking and certainly making for some interesting photographs, but in reality, more often than not, they prove to be just as mad and ill-conceived as the ideology that commissioned them. Thanks for watching.